Senator Marco Rubio's foreign policy advisor.
We were both alarmed at the realization that our democracy was under attack. We have both served in national security positions in the executive branch, Jamie in Congress. We've worked with our European partners to help support them in the face of Russian aggression. Music. And neither of us, maybe naively, but like many in the national security community in the US, many of us didn't think that this was a threat that would reach our shores. And yet, it did. This is a toolkit that Vladimir Putin is using, an old toolkit, old playbook, that has been supercharged with new tools. It's an asymmetric toolkit that runs a breadth of different means, but that is being used to undermine our democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. We believe that this is a threat that demands a transatlantic response, and one that does not allow itself to be divided by partisan loyalties. So Jamie and I joined together at GMF last summer to start a program that is looking comprehensively at the threat that Russia and potentially other authoritarian states are posing to our democracies using these means, and developing strategies to be able to combat it. We believe that it's important not only to think about this in the sense of what Putin is doing. We do see China already adopting some of these tactics. And we also believe it's really important that we start to look ahead at the way that technology is changing and new threats will be emerging.
So I'm going to walk through our first tool that we released about 6 months ago through the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Our approach to this problem that Laura described is basically to provide open source analysis to scope out the problem, to raise awareness about the problem. Part of the issue that we face, especially in the United States, but also in many European countries, is the fact that the Russians exploit our technologies, our social media platforms, and many Americans certainly are unaware that this is happening. They don't believe it's happening, and they're not willing then to support common sense solutions to address the problem. And so one of the things we're doing is developing a variety of open source tools which will complement the information that's already been released by congressional investigations, by the recent Mueller indictment about the Internet Research Agency, to show Americans and Europeans what is happening, and to raise awareness and shine a spotlight on the actual challenge. The first tool that we've released 6 months ago is called Hamilton 68. It's named after the Federalist 68, in which Alexander Hamilton warned about the threat of foreign influence in American democracy. And it's an open source Twitter dashboard which tracks in real time roughly 600 Twitter accounts, which our data experts have been following for 4 years. It's a network of accounts that engage on American political issues. These are not, just to be clear, the media often describes these as Russian bots. Some of these accounts are bots, some are actually generated by humans, some are a mix. We believe through just showing the issues that are being promoted by a network like this on a regular basis, we can actually make more people aware. So a couple lessons that we've learned over the last 6 months from the data. If you look at this first slide from November, the challenge we have in the US is there's this perception that Russian propaganda would be immediately recognizable, that every American would understand that the Russians were trying to promote a pro-Russian or pro-Putin message. The reality of their efforts, especially on social media, is that they often mix traditional foreign policy topics, like in this case, Syria, Ukraine, Donbass, white helmets also relating to Syria, with domestic political topics. And so on this day, November 29th, you see mixed in there some general tweeting about Trump, Make America Great Again, and then Pocahontas, which is a derogatory term that the president used for a US senator, which was a very hot topic on conservative social media. The next slide, which shows the top 10 hashtags that have been pushed by our network over the last 6 months, shows the same theme, a mix of foreign policy topics with domestic topics. On the far right, you'll see things like fake news. You'll see on the edge something called Release the Memo, which was a controversy also related to a congressional debate about the Mueller investigation and the way that the Trump campaign was investigated by the FBI. So again, this mix of traditional propaganda with domestic politics, which makes it difficult for users of these platforms to understand what's getting thrown at them. The other thing that it allows an entity like Russia to pull Americans in by using divisive domestic political topics, gain more followers, and then they can also insert their traditional priorities related to foreign policy. The next thing that we've learned is that these tools are, targets are equal opportunity. There's another misperception often that it's only one political side of the political spectrum that gets pushed or attacked. We have seen repeatedly over the course of the last 6 months that it's not just Democrats that are being targeted by these accounts. It's also Republicans. This is an example from last September after Senator John McCain voted against a health care bill. And you see for that day themes, Arizona, John McCain, traitor, dominated the trending topics on this particular network. We've also seen pretty much every other major Republican political figure, including members of the Trump administration, targeted by these networks. Also yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Governor Mitt Romney, when he was under consideration for Secretary of State, was also attacked by a number of Russian-controlled accounts as well. The thing to point out here, we're not making any statements and accusations that the Russians are creating these views. There are many Americans who have very strong views about politicians, including politicians of their own party. But what we have seen on this network is that they come in, they swarm, they amplify, they make the fringe views and the loudest voices often seem even louder, which especially with social media platforms can manipulate the way that the algorithms determine what many Americans see on a regular basis. So the next slide actually relates to some European topics because we also see, even on a US-focused network, European themes. This was one from October where we saw the Catalan referendum trending in the US network. We also have a separate dashboard called Article 38, which is a German language dashboard. And you saw similar themes being pushed both in German language and through the American-focused network. And then of concern as well are their efforts to divide Americans and Europeans. There's been a lot of documentation in the past of the way that the Russians promote a certain image of America, both internally within Russia and through their outlets in Europe. We're seeing the same thing on the network that we track. These fringe blogs, which would be promoted by the accounts that we monitor, pushing extreme views of security issues in Europe, the notion that there's terrorism in Europe. Everywhere in Europe, it's unsafe, all kinds of other themes that create this perception amongst the readers in the US that Europe is in a horrible state, should not be a place we want to go or visit or work with.
Thanks, Jamie. So in addition to the work we're doing looking at the information operations that Jamie outlined, we're also looking, as I mentioned, across the full toolkit that Russia is using, trying to understand how these individual tools operate, but also how they cross national boundaries. One of the things that we know is that many of these are sort of transnational threats. We think there's lessons that we can be learning from others' experiences. We also think there's real value in connecting dots that will lead to better detection of these kinds of methods going forward, as well as inform our policy responses. So a little preview of what's to come in some of the work that we're doing now is actually putting together network maps of different incidents. Here you see a sampling of cyber attacks that have been attributed to Russia across the transatlantic space. And you see one being highlighted here, which was an attack about a year ago on Norway's Labour Party by an entity called Cozy Bear, for anybody who's tracked the various Russian cyber actors. But their foreign ministry and defense ministry, I believe, was hacked at the same time. And here, a little bit of a sample of some of the social influence that we're tracking. So well known, of course, is Russia's loan to Front National in France. Also in the wake of the Italian elections, there's been a lot of reporting about some of the ties between the Five Star Movement and Lega Nord with Russian political entities. So we're looking across the full spectrum of these issues, trying to get a better sense of how it all fits together. We're doing that because A, we think it's analytically interesting and will help us better detect these things going forward, but B, because we think having that full picture is really important for developing the kinds of policy responses, both on the defensive side and for deterrence and raising the costs on this kind of aggression. And for that work, we're really, really grateful to have the benefit of an advisory council of former national security officials from both parties in the U.S. as well as European officials. And today I'm really privileged to be able to turn the mic over to former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers, who serves on our advisory council and is going to give us some thoughts on ways that we can begin to really push back on this threat. So, Chairman Rogers.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it very much. Great to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks for any warm welcome. I was at the airport earlier, and somebody came up and said, "Did anyone ever tell you look a lot like Mike Rogers?" And I said, "Well, people do say that." And he said, "God, that must be awful." So, thanks for any warm welcome. And if that guy wants to buy me a drink later, I'll be at the bar. First of all, thanks for being here, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund for doing this. This is pretty progressive work on something that's pretty dicey. And the first line of defense we're going to have against this moving forward, Russia or anyone else, is transparency. So Laura and Jamie have really put together an incredible team and doing incredible work. And if you haven't been on the Hamilton 68 site, it's great to see, and it'll give you a little chill just about how good they are. And let's just think quickly about how fast this thing has come. So we watched, my good friend the ambassador is here from Estonia, former ambassador to the United States from Estonia. When Estonia was hit by Russia, it really fundamentally changed all of the way that those of us in national security space looked at cyber. The Russians had finally said it is a military weapon of which we will all have to react. We will plan our military, both offensive and defensive issues around preparatory cyber attacks. Fundamental change. And then you just kept fast forwarding. Why? It is cheaper to invest in a cyber program than it is to buy an aircraft carrier. And so we noticed that countries who were on the fringe, who back in 2005 and 6 and 7 wouldn't even put on the list of people we should be worried about, started getting their cyber capabilities really good. And there was lots of open source information, and of course they could go on the dark web and buy just about any piece of malware code that they could possibly either engineer, re-engineer, or apply to their nefarious means. And then we saw nation states decide, wow, if Russia did that and got away with it, is there something interesting we can do? We saw Iran probing our US financial institutions back in about 2012. We found that North Korea went after the Sony Corporation and had a pretty devastating impact of it. And it wasn't just about the movie. The financial destruction that they did in that company was real and very serious. We watched the Iranians decide they were going to use cyber for a political purpose. They went after the Sands Resort Casino when the CEO gave a speech, a private speech, about why that it was bad for Iran to get a nuclear weapon and why the United States should rally around policies to prevent that. They decided that was an affront. They used cyber to go after that particular company, cause real harm in a destructive way. Now what happened? You see a move forward a little bit again. You have the Russians have decided this. They have been engaged in information operations since they've been an intelligence service, way back in the 1930s. And they've had some successes and some not so successes. They thought Latin America was going their way, according to the Matroikin archives. They really believed that they were influencing the outcome of elections in Latin America in the 70s and 80s. Well, imagine if you're that information officer and I could reach in with a well-researched information campaign and touch you in your home. I can touch you in your car. I can touch you at work, touch you on your phone. Amazing the power of all of that, their history in information operations, if I could apply that in a way that causes division on really social issues. So you saw what they did in Ukraine. They manufactured the story about the Ukrainians raping a Russian girl and had big success there until people kind of figured it out. When German NATO troops went into Lithuania, they tried it again. They said that the Germans who were there raped a 14-year-old Russian girl. Now, we were better prepared. The NATO operations were better prepared. But they still were successful in creating that social division in Lithuania. this is not going to stop here. In the U.S. elections, whoever that general officer is that walked in and said, I got a great idea, right? And by the way, they tested it right up to 2014 in places like Ukraine and the former Soviet republics. And it had some success. So they said, 2014, let's go. We're ready. We're ready to take this platform to the United States. And if you imagine, that guy is probably a 12-star general today. Wildly successful. They have managed to get Americans at each other's throat. We're not even sure why we don't like each other in some places of America today. But if you look at the hashtags, you can see they're taking every divisive issue and ramping it up. The most recent of the disclosures on this is they pitted American Christian groups against American Muslim groups. They were pitting white supremacist groups, right, who already have views that are on the extreme. They ramped them up, and then they tried to pit them against black activist groups who were active in the election. Those divisive actions had real consequences, and it's going to get worse. So what we hope to talk about today, we want to make sure we have time for questions, is what can we do to provide a deterrence? Why? Laura talked about it. China has decided, wow, no consequence really for what they've done. Anybody think the United States is going to get those 13 Russians who were indicted? Raise your hand. I have some property to sell you. It's a little wet. It's in Florida. Yeah? We're never going to get those folks, and they're living the life of luxury in Russia today. That's a badge of honor. So we're going to have deterrence that goes deeper. China is now saying, wow, Russia got away with it, very little consequence, hard to attribute the problem. We ought to start looking at it. And the real concern for me is we're watching Iran take that shift as well. We're seeing activities in the Middle East that are very, very concerning about what Iran is trying to do, using this core understanding of how information operations can influence politics and can get sects of people in any country at each other's throat. So I do believe that there's a great deterrence that we can do. Again, the first one, transparency. Second one, we have to be able to understand what our cyber capabilities are in a joint understanding, meaning with our allies, offensively, to try to shut this down, either shut it down or have a destructive attack at the worst end of it. We have to have something that we have in our toolkits, sanctions. We need to really start looking at a cross-the-pond here sanction regime where we can aggressively apply it to folks that we understand are engaged in this activity. There must be some consequence. On the far end of that extreme, the Pentagon talked about this about a year, U.S. Pentagon talked about this a year ago, and people got a little nervous about it, but you have to put it on the table, is that some kinetic strike capability, a military action at the far end of it. Imagine if a country came in and shut down Brussels completely in its electric grid for not a day or two or a week or two, but 30 days, 60 days, and you're not getting it back up. Imagine the chaos. Think of everything from food distribution to transportation to getting cash. It all goes away, right? We're going to have a problem. Same in America. We always plan for the eastern seaboard with the lights going out. And sadly enough, we've seen nation states who have had the capability. We have found them on our networks in our electric grid, meaning they had the capability, if they so desired, to turn them off. We think we got them out. Cyber is a changing industry with a changing threat matrix like I've never seen. So getting it right on deterrence is going to be critically important. Hopefully we'll have that discussion today. Laura?
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Chairman Rogers. And
Surprised them. And here we go. But very
to now be able to invite some.
that every single soul
Sen
who
yalnız
sees
hazır
me
tut.
talks to me about
Sildin mi o
I think
şeyi?
we've got an open mic
Hayır.
somewhere.
Tamam.
It's questions from the ethers. Well, we'd like to go ahead and invite some questions for Chairman Rogers. Let me just start right over here. Can we get a microphone over here?
Hello, thank you. My name is Dr. Wes Bellamy. I'm the immediate past Vice Mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, still a city councilman. So as you talk about white supremacy and then Black Lives Matter groups and whatnot, that's right up my alley. So one question, particularly in regards to the Russians and how they're interfering. I would love to have advice from you about what can we specifically tell our local governments, individuals like myself, that we can do to try to prohibit these attacks or make our people more aware and not be sucked into some of the ideology and what we see in the media. Any advice from that regards? And then also, just a follow-up question with that, like, moving forward, what can we tell younger groups to do, as we have people from the GMF Foundation and YPS? What can we do as younger leaders to help combat this issue? Because we don't want it all to fall on the higher-ups.
Yeah, this is the most difficult problem we face. So the first line of defense is an understanding, is the education that, listen, don't believe everything you read. How many teachers still tell you that they have to tell kids you can't go to Wikipedia to do your homework research, right? And we're still in that mode. And so there is this new generation coming up that they read it on the internet, right? Must be true. Now, my kids are in their 20s, and I still have to work with them on, like, no, seriously, every bad thing you read about me clearly couldn't be true. Really? Come on. So one of the things is transparency. That's why I love this project, because the first thing they're trying to do is put the information out there. And it's just those kind of discussions to keep it up. Unfortunately, even the whole of government approach now, what we were trying to do at one point was say, shouldn't the government team up with the private sector and say, guess what, here's where we think the Russians are coming at you with this kind of misinformation. A, how do we get it out there? And then how do we ask the private sector to help us police this? And police is the wrong term, but they should be able to shut some things off that we know are clearly in violation of US law. And outsiders trying to influence elections in any way or trying to create violence on the streets of your town is clearly against the law. And so we're not very close to getting it to the right place. Again, I think there's some groups starting locally to try to push back on the narrative, but candidly, we're not very close to a solution yet, which is why, again, this to me is so important. This is about the only place you can go and find real-time tracking of at least the Russians at this point. We'd hope that we would expand this later, because she needs more work to do, don't you, Laura?
Definitely need more
exactly.
work, yeah.
To show where there's outside influence. And there's also we have internal factors in this as well. Those people that tend to be small can have a huge megaphone if they do it right in cyberspace. And so it's just a constant effort at this. There's also some talk about trying to go into schools. Your kids probably were, how old were they when they were on the, they could figure their way around a computer or an iPhone or whatever, but they had no understanding of security, right? They didn't understand that they also are responsible for security. It's never taught in schools. Maybe you get a class in college if you're lucky. You don't get anything in the K through 12 system in the United States. I bet it's probably the same in Europe. Can we change that to where people are starting to become more aware earlier that, hey, guess what? People are going to throw things at me that are wrong, that are corrupt, that are trying to influence my decision or get me energized. The part of that, what the Russians were doing was trying to energize those factions to do something, to get at each other's throat. And that's what we have to worry about in this. Yeah.
Let me turn to this side of the room, just give an opportunity. How about right here?
Chapter Corps, I'm on the staff of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Washington. What's your view on recreating the U.S. Information Agency or something like that to counter agitprop and so forth?
I would do it. I would try to use some of the old tools we used to have to counter. They were really used to counter information operations in many ways. I would bring it back. And the only reason, we have to have a trusted source, right? So now we're in the age of affirmation news, at least we are in the United States, where if I believe X, I am drawn to the news that says X. If I believe Y, I'm drawn to the news that says Y, right? I want you to tell me what I already believe. And so we have to start establishing some places where you can go where you believe that you're getting good and honest and fair information. And so I think the State Department in its old model could go a long way into helping us create that space where you can get to.
I think we have time maybe for one more very brief question. So let me go with the gentleman here.
Thanks a lot, Rolf Fuchs. The first question is, what's the state of international coordination and cooperation in responding to these kind of cyber attacks within NATO, the US, EU, and the European governments? And the second one is how far could you attribute these kind of attacks to the Russian government? I'm asking that before the backdrop of a massive hack to the German governmental communication system last year. And the official statement, the official response of the German government was, there is no smoking gun. So how to deal with that politically?
Yeah. Let me take the attribution piece first. Very, very difficult to do. So the more sophisticated the cyber actor, the more difficult it is to get it right the first time. This is why I've been very vocal about not having the private sector go out and start shooting at people they think have attacked them, right? The private sector defense looks a lot like vigilantism to me. In the United States, our National Security Agency is getting better and better and better at attribution, but it is a long and difficult process. It's not as easy as people would think. Think about all the cutouts that you could use. You can launch an attack from Moscow, and it looks like it's coming, from Barcelona. I mean, or Miami, or both, or all of them. And so the trick here is you've got to get attribution piece right. All of our agencies need to be brought up to the same level. We're not. Across our European allies, NATO. Remember when NATO, all the officers got their phones? They were sending text messages to the officers' phones, confusing their orders about, good company, low-level command and control, right? Huge problem. They had broken into the system. I think it was the Russians. I think it was a nation state. Did I say the Russians? Oh, okay. Just checking. And so we're having this attribution problem, but it's getting better. And that's going to be key to any cyber offensive effort. That's why you can't automatically say, well, we think it's the Russians, let's go ping them in the forehead. It might not be the Russians. And then we may have started something that we can't control on that. And the second part of that question was?
Transatlantic cooperation.
Transatlantic, yeah. Here's the problem. Snowden left a hangover, and I have to tell you, he is in the loving arms of the FSB outside of Moscow today. Some notion that somebody, let me back up. I lived a year of my life through this as chairman, and so I'd really like to have that year back, please. But what we do know is that created a huge rift between allies and companies where it should not have done that, at least to the degree. Certainly worth a discussion, certainly worth, hey, should we be doing X or Y? Let's have another review of it. But that hurt us. We still debate today in the EU and the United States privacy and security, and they can't separate them. You can have privacy, and we definitely need security, but this notion that privacy is the way we approach security, we're going to lose that fight every day, all day long, like we are losing today. So we've got to start having dialogue. We have to agree to a certain set of facts and then start having the discussion. You can have privacy and security. When people say you have to give up a little of one to get the other, they don't understand how cyber works. You can have them both, but you have to start having the conversation that they are different and they are separate. And till we get there, we're not going to be any closer to this. We're going to continue this. We're in a cyber war. It's in the United States, certainly in Europe. Most Europeans and Americans don't know it, and I'm not sure we're winning. And until we start coming together on this, we're going to have lots of problems. What we're watching now is nation-state caliber tradecraft in cyber attacks and destruction being shifted, right, to non-nation states. This gets to the attribution problem. So we indicted some Chinese folks for doing bad things to us, about 5 of them a couple of years ago, 2012, I think it was, 13 maybe, right? And what we found was that the Chinese changed their tactics. And now you have contractors out doing work that we know is probably at the behest of the Chinese intelligence services, right? Now you got a problem, right? And what we're seeing with Russia, the same thing. We're seeing nation-state tradecraft being shifted to international organized crime elements, which means they're really good, and they can be devastating. And if you're under sanctions, think of this, if you're a country under sanctions and I can hurt you economically, why not? It doesn't cost me anything, right? This is what we're going through, and we're still trying to debate the privacy rules under, under an old notion about privacy and security. We're behind. I really worry about this. I think we're just well behind the wagon train on this. And they're getting more and more sophisticated, which is really uplifting, right? This would be better if you had a drink in your hand, I think, actually. Thank you for that.
Well,
thanks.
Ending on that really uplifting note, a lot we could continue to discuss here, but thank you, Chairman Rogers, for joining us here. Thank you all for the questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
But it's that after lunch session that's always a challenge, and you definitely kept everybody's attention. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciated your sharing with us the important work you're doing and exposing the full toolkit. So thank you. It is now my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome to the Brussels Forum